Ladies and gentlemen, theologians of all shapes, sizes, and theological proclivities, this is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we like to bring you some ingredients for you to brew your own faith. And today on the podcast, and the day it is I'm speaking of is the one in which you're listening to this, is my friend Bart Campolo. That's right. You may be saying to yourself, is this the Bart Campolo who's Tony Campolo's son and ran mission year and probably, if you're my age, spoke at your Christian school's mandatory chapel with sermons about justice and open theism? Yes, it is that Bart Campolo, but he left God behind. He's now he's still an evangelist, as you'll see. He tries to evangelize me on behalf of his secular humanism, trying to bring me. He's like, look, you're a minister. Look, you know things. You're smart. You should join my team. You can leave God behind, but you can't leave your evangelism behind if you're Bart Campolo. And I just want you to know, there's hardly anyone I enjoy being evangelized by more, because I just really respect him and enjoy him. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy this podcast because it's quite a bit of fun. And a couple times he even tries to bait me into responding and stuff. I was going to break rank and switch being the interviewer and try to say too much, and he almost got me. It wasn't as difficult as the time I talked to the guy that was the intelligent design dude. That one was hard to just do the interviewing side, but we're gonna have to do this again. That's right, Bart. I know when you listen to this, say look, we'll do it again, and the next time we'll just have to go a little bit more back and forth. But be prepared. Be prepared. You don't want to listen to this in front of your children. No, not because of strong language, but because Bart's just nice and persuasive. You don't want to ruin them until they get older, have existential crises and stuff like that. That's when you want to have them go through that dark night of the soul and figure out the relationship with God or not again, and things like that. I don't know. Maybe you should listen to it with your kids, because I know what kids appreciate. Hour and a half long theology conversations. Anyway, this is Bart Campolo on the podcast. And before we jump into it, I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for all of you that have recently started dropping some reviews over there on iTunes and the Stitcher or whatever other app it is that you access podcasts. It means a lot to get that kind of support and such, and sharing it with friends. I got an email from email from someone who had a friend introduced on the podcast saying, I can't believe they finally told me about this. We've been friends for years, the same church, talking about this kind of stuff. And then she was like, have you listened to Homebrewed? And I hadn't, and now I have. And this is awesome. So don't be the friend that doesn't tell it to your friend. If you know that friend is the one who would enjoy it. You know what I'm saying? Obviously you do. That's why you're so smart listening to this podcast. I want to give a shout out to everyone in the Homebrewed community. They are the ones that support the podcast. Keep it going. If you want to be a member of the Homebrewed community, you can go to homebrewedcommunity.com. You can donate each month, be a part of our secret Facebook group, give input and such to what's going to be happening at the podcast, join live Q&As, be a part of our Epic Reads group that Philip Clayton and I have been doing. You'll be a part of some high gravity classes. I'm currently doing an introduction to theology class that you can join. There's tons of perks, tons of ways we can connect and go back and forth for those that are a member of the community. So go to homebrewedcommunity.com, and that's the best way to join up. Plus, you get an ecclesiastical title. Yeah, that's right. When you join, you can be an acolyte, a bishop, an elder, a deacon. And who doesn't want that? Probably plenty of people. I know one, Bart Campolo, but he didn't know I was going to do this, Bart. You're the humanist bishop. I've decided, by the power vested in me, by the flying spaghetti monster, I've decided you are the bishop of humanism. So you're welcome. I'm going to get you some really sweet hat next time we hang out. All right, Bart? You got that? All right. Here you go, everybody. Bart Campolo. Peace. Well, hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. Today, you're going to talk to a real evangelist, like so evangelizing. He's evangelizing evangelicals for good news without God. What's up, Bart?
How you doing, Tripp?
Well, I woke up this morning and the Holy Spirit said to me, you need to bring the gospel today. And then what happens? You end up right here on the video.
Do you think this could be the time when, like, could this be the moment? Because there are many people out there praying for my reconversion. If you could pull it off, it would be quite a story.
Dude, you don't want anyone to know about your reconversion until you got that book deal inked. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, whenever we get tight on money, my son always says to me, Dad, there's a lot of money in you just, the book, I'm back.
Yeah. Or it's like,
I was wrong. I was wrong. Sunday's still coming. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk about you. If people don't know Bart Campolo, then what's your you're like talking to a USC undergrad, and they're like, well, who are you, Baldy? What's up with that?
Like, how do I introduce myself to them?
Yeah. What's the short version of your story when people don't know you? Because I'm sure plenty listening do, but there'll be those that don't, and they're like, I don't ever listen to evangelicals, but maybe this evangelical that says they don't believe in God, I might listen.
Well, my bottom line, my baseline story is, one that because you knew me back in the day. Like, I came and spoke at your Christian college when you were a student. Mm-hmm. So like, I'm this guy who grew up outside of Philadelphia in the household of Tony Campolo, who was a famous Christian evangelist, and became a Christian when I was in high school. Got all excited, like joined this youth group, got all excited about ministry, ended up in the inner city working for like 30 years with poor people. And the short version of my story is over the course of those 30 years, I became more and more committed to social justice, to loving relationships, to building community. And I became less and less able to believe in the supernatural aspects of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so about 5 years ago, it dawned on me, like, there's nothing left of my supernaturalism. I don't believe in a God who actually intervenes in history. I don't believe Jesus actually rose from the dead. I don't believe that there is any, after we die, that there's any kind of extension of consciousness or eternal life. I think this life is it. And so what happened is I lost my supernatural credulity, my ability to believe that stuff. But my values all stayed pretty much the values that brought me into Christianity, that made me think it was such a cool lifestyle. When I came out, I was like, that's still loving people and fighting for justice and cultivating a sense of gratitude for the privilege of being alive. That still makes sense to me. And so, for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been trying to figure out, what does life and ministry and kind of joy and all that stuff look like on the other side of faith? Mm-hmm. Is that, is that a reasonable, what do you call it, summary of my life?
I think it's a great summary. And when I first met you, I was an undergrad at Campbell University, and you were speaking, and this is when you were an open theist. So as like the proto process person on campus, I was just thrilled that anyone else said God wasn't omnipotent and didn't know the future completely, because that never got said unless I was talking in class. So I remember that, and we went to and we had a meal or whatever, and I remember being the processy type going, well, come on, like the open theist thing, isn't that kind of just how you say it if evangelicals are in the room? Wouldn't you say it differently if they weren't? Because like it's basically processed with this weird like Jesus escape clause in it, so the eschatological assurance is there, and you don't have to be too reliant on science. You just pick the right prophets passages versus the other prophets passages. And I remember you were just straightforward, like that's not what's going on. And I was like, I was really hoping that you were just a closeted Whiteheadian, and no, you explained to me how the Bible functions authoritatively, and
in spite of the fact that it was, and like what happened to me was when the Bible fell apart for me in college, I was studying under a guy named James Barr, who was like this unbelievably important biblical scholar from Oxford, England.
But at Brown, right?
Yeah, I was at Brown when this happened. And so, I'm studying under this guy, and, I walk in there as like a straight up evangelical, and he just tore apart my sense that the Bible was in any way, lacking in contradictions or flaws or errors, all those things that like anybody who sticks around, anybody who spends 10,000 hours with the Bible, gets to that place.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just remember it happening like in 5th grade.
Right. There's all this stuff in there. So
and then you have the I'm interested, like, when you have that conversation with your dad. Like, because if anyone knows your dad, he's like notoriously like a nerdy evangelical who regularly explains to other evangelicals not to be ignoramuses. Be it around, because he teaches sociology, but I mean, he's obviously more informed than a lot of the public voices in evangelicalism. How does that conversation go over Thanksgiving, where you're like, Dr. Barr's saying this, what's up with this, Pops?
Well, what happened to me was like, I'm studying under Barr, and Barr sort of like tears apart the Bible for me. And I'm thinking, gosh, I really, like, my life is built around this book. And so I go to him and I say, like, what do I do? And he says, listen, man. He doesn't say, listen, man. He's an Oxford Don. He barely talks to me. But he said, he just threw me this one morning. He says, you should do your final paper on the writing of Karl Barth. And so I ended up going to the library with a buddy of mine and like burying myself in Karl Barth for about a month. And Barth's concept of the Bible is that the book itself is not the word of God, but that Jesus is the word of God, and he has chosen, for whatever reason, to speak through the Bible. So the book itself is full of flaws and errors and mistakes, but that doesn't matter, because like what happens is the Holy Spirit takes that gobbledygook and makes sense of it in your brain. Like the Holy Spirit speaks to you through the Bible. And that was so awesome to me, because all of a sudden the Bible could still be authoritative because God chose to use it without having to like stand the test of logical consistency or any of that stuff. And so, Bart's, it was funny because I called my dad on the phone and said, hey, I think I'm going to be able to stay a Christian. And he said, really, what happened? And I said, well, I read the readings of Karl Barth, and, the whole idea turned around. And my dad said, that's what happened to me in seminary. He said, that's why I named you Bart. He said, that guy saved my faith, and I named you after him. I thought, if I ever have a son, I'm going to name him after the guy who saved my faith. Well, what's funny now, Tripp, is I look back at Karl Barth. Karl Barth made it possible for me to stay a Christian for another 20 years. I don't know, like when I told the story early on, Karl Barth was my savior. Now he's my enabler. Like he enabled me to stay connected to a narrative that fundamentally makes no sense to me. And I was on my way out when I was 22, and he sucked me back in.
So what have you noticed the differences between Christians where you have this conversation and they were ones that didn't grow up with that type of relationship to the Bible, but are joyfully Christian, critical thinking, like what you discovered in class is not new news to them? Right.
You mean like liberal Christians and stuff?
Or ones that are more liturgically based.
Yeah.
Or I'm teaching charismatic students, and in some sense they like the idea that the Bible was this thing that you trusted and then now it's gone to them.
Yeah, that's not them.
Yeah, they're like, I got the Holy Spirit. I don't know what you're talking about. Or
and I think that for me, like what drove me out of Christianity, or what pulled me out of Christianity, wasn't just, the Bible's falling apart, because there are lots of ways to be a Christian without really believing that the Bible is literally true. There are progressive Christians and liturgical Christians and, all these kinds of folks. I think for me, ultimately, that was just the first cut in my death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that most of the other cuts were that on some level, believing in a good and loving, like, first of all, if you're going to believe in God, you'd better believe in a good and loving God. Like, what's the point? It's hard enough to have faith. Like, if you're going to believe in any God, you might as well believe in a really good one.
I mean, I've thought that, but honestly, if you listen to people talk long enough, you really have some doubts as to whether or not, like, one of my absolutist rules is that if you're a Christian, you should at least think God's as nice as Jesus. But,
well, I always think like you should at least think God's as nice as you. Like if the God you worship isn't at least as nice as you are, like, you know, like the God I worship, you know, like I meet people and like the God they worship, like he's sending Gandhi to hell, you know, like for having the wrong theology, or the God they worship could stop, you know, a hurricane from decimating, you know, an island, or could stop the Haitian earthquake. But he sits on his hands. He just doesn't. Although, you know, like he occasionally intervenes to save their friend from cancer, but he doesn't.
Praise the Lord.
You know, and so, yes. And so I'm always like, wow, if the God you believe in, like you would save Haiti from the earthquake, wouldn't you, Tripp? Like, so
this is like why I always say that half of the Christians' understanding of divine power, it leads me to think I would not even let God babysit.
Right. So
you're not going to let your kid get near someone with that logic.
Oh no, he's a horror. And so, you know, and like even if you let him off the hook for all the genocide in the Old Testament, and even if you let him off the hook for basically condemning all of humanity to hellfire and brim. Like the weird thing about God is like with original sin, like the New Testament's worse than the Old Testament, because at least in the Old Testament, when God kills you, he then leaves you alone. In the New Testament, when God kills you, your troubles have just begun. Like you're in for an eternity of torture. And so like all of that weird stuff, you know, like you wouldn't do that to somebody. Like even the notion like, okay, look, you've sinned against me, Tripp. So I'm going to forgive you, but I have to kill somebody in order to forgive you. Like you wouldn't do that. Like you forgive people all the time without killing anybody.
And it is an odd definition of forgiveness if someone pays it.
Yeah. It's
like, I don't know, but when I say I forgive you to my wife, it's not because I took it out on the kid.
That's right. You know, so penal substitutionary atonement, original sin, like you teach little children, hey, little child, you are worthy of everlasting torture and damnation, but because of his great love for you, God will save you. Probably not most of humanity, but you. Isn't this great? Like to teach a kid, like if you taught a little kid that there's a monster in the closet that's going to kill him if he doesn't, you know, accept Jesus as personal Lord and Savior, people would call you they would say that was child abuse. They would say that was emotional, you know, harm. And so the weird thing about it is that when you know, the Bible, letting go of the Bible, you can do that and still believe in a good and loving God. But the problem is, like, if you want to believe in a good and loving God, you can't believe that God has any power, because the good and loving God who could intervene, you know, like if he can intervene and he doesn't, he sucks. And so it creates this I'm not saying this very well, but you kind of get my notion, is that what happened to me was, you know, kind of the litany of unanswered, you know, a friend of mine who always says to me, hey, Bart, remember, nothing fails like prayer, you know, and like you would pray for, not
know. What about American democracy? Because,
what about American democracy?
Well, I'm just saying, if we talk about success rate, we can at least demonstrate that scientifically that occasionally the act of doing it, regardless of God's participation, does something positive for the person. I'm not sure American democracy necessarily that directedness towards focusing on it has contributed much to the well-being of anyone recently.
No, I mean, like the thing about prayer is prayer does work precisely as often. Divine intervention happens as a result of prayer precisely as often as it would happen if nobody prayed at all. Like miraculous stuff happens all the time in this world. There's so many things going on that something improbable is going to be happening at any given time. I mean, if you win the lottery, Tripp, that's a miracle. Like, you know,
I guess it would, because I don't play.
Right. It's a gajillion to one that you would win, or that's like, I would buy you a ticket in your, like, and send it to you in the mail, and it would be the one that would win. That would be a miracle. But you know, somebody wins the lottery every day. And so to that person, it's a miracle. To a mathematician, it's just math.
Mm-hmm.
And so the weird thing about for me was, the Bible being full of weirdness was one thing. The fundamental doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement that I grew up with, that's another thing. But just the idea that there is a good and loving God involved in the lives of humanity, even that strains. Like you have to work. I had to work really hard as a Christian to always make excuses for why this God either did what he did or didn't do what he didn't do. And so after a while, like, people say to me, what was your primary emotion when you realized that you couldn't believe in God anymore? And the answer, to be honest with you, was just relief. Mm-hmm. I was tired of defending a God that, if he existed, was kind of indefensible. Mm-hmm. And it's like when I see like ultra hip, emergent, progressive, super, process oriented theologians like yourself. That's how I see you, by the way.
Well, you should have put it on the back of my book, but probably ended the sentence there. Go ahead.
But when I see guys like you, sometimes I feel like, wow, you are doing a lot of gymnastics in order to hold on to the words Jesus and God. And I sometimes wonder, why?
What's interesting is penal substitutionary atonement, that understanding of Scripture, even supernaturalist understandings of metaphysics,
divine intervention. You're not counting
all those things. I just didn't ever grow up with as those weren't normal.
So what is the content of the word God for you?
So if you don't see, when I hear the way you use the word miracle and supernatural, I think of David Hume defining it in a very kind of deterministic, dualistic type of way. So and I always hear that from evangelicals and usually people that study biology and not physics, if you're doing religion science dialogue. And I always wonder so both of us had minister parents.
No, but wait back. I hate to stop you, but I just want to know what you mean when you say God.
What do I mean when I say God?
Yeah. Like you believe in God. Mm-hmm. What does that mean? What do you believe that is the content of God? What is God?
In what kind of...
what an evangelical thinks of when they say, I believe in God. They believe in a person who is driving history towards a predetermined conclusion. Mm-hmm. A God who is like your Uncle Charlie in the sense of he wants something. There's some things that make him mad. There's some things he really likes. Sometimes he does something, sometimes he doesn't do something. They think of God as a person. I don't think you think of God that way.
Well, I would say God's not less than personal in the sense of personality as an emergent property among sentient beings is at least the most advanced part of evolutionary emergence we've gotten to. So should you affirm that there's a principle of limitation if you're thinking metaphysically or some type of lure towards the possibility and such, it would not be less than personal, but that doesn't mean it's personal. That's
do you have any idea how a university sophomore who heard you just say that paragraph would say, I have no idea what you're talking about?
No, I would never talk about it that way to a university sophomore.
Well, just talk to me like I'm a university sophomore. I'm asking you, when you say I believe in God, what do you believe in?
I've never actually found that type of conversation to be useful to people. There's a difference between...
Wow, have you never been at a hospital bed when somebody's dying? Because then it's a really useful... people are or when you're trying when you're talking to somebody about an earthquake in Haiti, sometimes relieving people from the notion of a personal God is really important because they're believing that this personal God actually did this thing. And so then it really is it may not it's a really important conversation for people.
Well, I think there's a difference in discourses. Metaphysical discourse is, at least for me, a one around plausibility. And that's a different conversation than the existential level of discourse you would have around your understanding of God or the universe or axiological commitments and values.
See, I'm just a pastor. And so what happens is I'm with a college kid and we're talking about whether or not they're going to become a lawyer, or whether or not they're going to break up with their girlfriend, or whether or not they're going to use psychedelic drugs.
Okay.
And they're sort of wondering, like, on what basis do I make those decisions? And I sort of say to them, oh, well, I think this life is the only one that you get. Like, I have no reason to believe otherwise. And so if this life is the only one you get, like, I've looked at the data, and the people that sort of end up being the happiest and feeling like they invested their lives the best are always those who are committed to building loving relationships and to doing work that makes the world better for other people, and to cultivating a sense of gratitude for the privilege of just being alive. And so I want you to make decisions based on those things, like how, and so in a sense, like, I'm just a pastor who's going, like, if you believe that this life is all that there is, you're going to live one way and you're going to make decisions on that basis. If you believe that, like, this is just a test run and you have eternity with Jesus, you might make different decisions.
Okay.
And so like, as a pastor,
do you think that
matters?
Do you think it's a necessity to Christianity to see this as just the test run?
No, there are lots of ways.
Because I would just say, like, in the New Testament,
there are a million ways to be a Christian. There are a million ways.
The Sermon on the Mount has all of those principles you just listed off in it. Like, when you pray, when you give, when you love, are descriptions of cultivating that type of solidarity and, investment in the community.
Absolutely. Above the surface, those icebergs look the same. But, like, when the chips are down and I'm in pain, I have found the reason why I think it's worth making the sacrifice is different now than it was when I believed that there was a person out there who had created me with this life in mind, and that this was, sort of, that there was going to be an extension of my consciousness beyond this life. And so, like, ultimately, like, there are many narratives that will lead you to being a good person. Or that will lead you to, like, feeding a hungry person, or whatever your measure is. But it's sort of like exercise programs. Like, there are many ways to get in shape, but you kind of got to pick one. And so, like, the students that I work with are virtually all students who say, like, yeah, all the supernatural narratives, none of those seem plausible to me. But I want to be a good person. So can you give me a narrative that gives me a reason to be a good person when the chips are down, that isn't based on any kind of God? And I go, like, yeah, I can do that. And that's what secular humanism really is. So when somebody in one of the more progressive Christian things is sort of like, yeah, the God I believe in doesn't work like that evangelical God, I just want to, like, okay, so but how does that God work? Like, what is the content of the word God? Like, what do they mean? I'm always curious. Like, so I have this friend at USC who's a progressive Christian, a guy named Jim Burklow. And he writes these great books on open Christianity and stuff like that. And in the end, like, it really feels like what he's saying is, like, what I call the universe, he calls God. And what I call love and redemption, he calls Jesus. But, like, really, it's semantics. Like, it helps him to hold on to those words. But the Jesus he believed in, like, did not rise from the dead, like, is not a physical presence, like, the God he believes in doesn't actually intervene. And so in the end, I end up going, like, wow, like, you do realize that language is kind of confusing to a lot of people. And he goes, like, yeah, but it really speaks to people who grew up in church. And so, what I always wonder is, when somebody's using God and Jesus language, I'm like, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of, like, multiple ways people handle that. If I went through the list of theologians I think don't really think that there's a God, there's a list of them. And I want, like, one of my issues, I guess, in that has been, at what point, if you are, appropriating a tradition's poetics, but not making the affirmation, I don't know, all of the people that have ever used it thought they were making when they did it?
Right.
Is it morally plausible, if that makes sense? Like, it's a moral problem. Like...
Or it's a semantic problem. Like, if you decide, like, listen, I know that you think a chair is this thing that you sit on, but I'm going to use chair, and from now on, chair means something that you speak into, and you hook it into your computer. You go like, everything you've always said was microphone. We're going to call it chair now. And I'm like, you can do that, but like, it's not morally wrong, but it's really confusing. And on some level, confusing people may be morally wrong. And I sort of go like, if what you mean by God is what everybody else just calls the natural universe, just call it the natural universe.
But if you call it the natural universe or whatever, like, there's a whole story to that in the West, which is like the naturalizing of theological language to apply to our teleological relationship to creation, right? Like, it is the language of universe or the cosmos, and science emerges from monotheism, monotheistic assumptions, and then you have the secularizing moves that come through science, and then you remove the supernatural part but keep the language. And I was talking to a couple of my friends that I was the only theist in the room, and they were saying that secular humanists and stuff need to come up with different language to talk about the world, because they are latently theological, that still gives this it has a ontic resonance in a sense.
Well, and I like that. Like what's funny is that that's the rap that everybody lays on me in the secular world, is they go like, Bart shows up and he preaches like a preacher. And he calls people to love one another, and he calls people to sacrificially care for the needs of the poor. And they're like,
what's that about, Bart?
They're like, what's that about?
Because I thought, like, if I became an atheist, I get more money, and
you get to like have sex with anyone you wanted to, and rape people,
only hot people,
because you'd have no moral compass.
Yeah.
And the reality, of course, is that religion doesn't create morality. It was morality that people eventually codified into religion. Morality emerges among social animals as just a way for them to get along with each other. What's right and wrong is, what works for the group and what doesn't work for the group. And so, in the end, what's interesting about the whole thing is, like, a lot of people, including me, thought that when I lost my faith in God, I would lose my motivation to pursue goodness in an intentional way. Mm-hmm. But I sure didn't. And in some ways now I look back at, I got a letter from a friend of mine the other day who said, like, gosh, if there's no heaven to hope for, and if there's no God in the universe, isn't life feel really meaningless to you? And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, on the contrary. Like, if this isn't, things become precious because they're finite. And if my life is finite, it's only the more precious to me. And then I ask this question, how do I make the most of it? And strangely enough, having sex with all those hot people, making a cajillion dollars and buying everything you want, like having the maximum number of like peak drug experiences, like all of those things, just on a purely statistical level, like on a purely like empirical level, do not lead people to register the highest levels of well-being and flourishing. Loving relationships, slam dunk. Doing work that makes a difference for other people always works. Like cultivating a sense of gratitude, that stuff works.
Do you think there's a correlation between those who actually like do seek to do those things, regardless of the poetic register that they do it in? So let's say you're in any wisdom tradition, or you're a humanist or not, but the ones who actually organize their life around community, changing people's lives for the better, well-being, that kind of stuff, those tend to be the ones in my guess, would be the ones that enjoy life in general, and in any tradition are the ones less concerned with the afterlife, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
In one sense, the fact that you did mission year and had a year with so many people who thought the world, the gospel was about getting saved, and you were like, guess what? The main course is right here, and it's in the face of your neighbor.
Heaven and hell never had anything to do with my Christianity.
Right. So I think there is some fear when people see how much enjoyment there can be in life when you didn't lose the Bart, the evangelist who shows up bringing words of good news, inviting you into deeper and reconciling
into a better life. I see a kid on the corner, he's like selling methamphetamines, and I'm like, kid, I got a better life for you. Mm-hmm. So like, but wait, you don't believe in God anymore? No, but I still got good news. Like my community, like if you come over here and live this way with us, you're going to be happier and the world is going to be better. It's just a better life. And so, yeah, I'm still an evangelist. And that's where in the secular community, people say, oh, you're just adapting all these Christian concepts. And like your friends saying like, hey, that's not, you need to find your own language. And you go like, no. The Christians stole that language in the first place or adapted it from just human morality. The Muslims do it like every religion draws on those basic human things like, oh, wow, eating together brings us closer together. Oh, wow, singing songs together brings us closer together. Oh, wow, rituals and rites of passage. And you go like, yeah, that's not Christian technology. That's human technology. And so the fact that it found its way into supernaturalism when that was our best explanation for what was going on in the world makes total sense to me. And I love the way that in all these religious traditions, all that human technology has been honed and figured out, and we're really good at being together and really good at inspiring people to good works and all that stuff. But having said that, like that stuff doesn't belong to any theistic tradition. That's just human goodness, man. And so, my thing is that I just think like as more and more people find it harder and harder to hold on to that language and the kind of the underlying theology behind it, I'm like, hey, we got to come up with a secular religion. We've got to come up with a way of creating communities of people that pursue goodness and that know how to sing together and that know how to raise their children with shared values together, that doesn't rely on a lot of language that doesn't correspond to anything anybody really believes anymore. And so when people are taking Christianity and making it, like my friend Brian McLaren and all these guys, like they're coming up with forms of Christianity that like are less offensive and that like they bend the Bible so that it's okay with women, and they bend it so that it's okay with gay people, and they bend it so that penal substitutionary atonement doesn't really it's not about that anymore. And I go like, I get it and I love it that they do it. I really do. I think that like they're the best kinds of Christians out there. I sometimes just wonder though, like, wouldn't it be easier rather than trying to retrofit your submarine into an airplane? Wouldn't it be easier to just start from scratch and build an airplane? Mm-hmm. And so when somebody like you, who I know has like you never even grew up with all the crazy nonsense that I grew up with, but like when somebody like you, whose concept of God probably corresponds more to my concept of the universe than to an evangelical's concept of God, I go like, why don't you just switch language, man? Wouldn't that be simpler?
The evangelizing moves of Bart Campolo
and I'm serious though. Like I'm not bullshitting you here. I'm really looking at you and going like, you're so smart and you're so good at talking to people about big ideas. And I go like, there are all these young people out there, and like for the ones that believe in supernatural realities, there are lots of people to preach to them. On my side of the game, with all these students at these elite institutions that don't believe in that stuff, almost nobody is trying to call them to lives of radical love and meaningful service and genuine wonder at just the amazing, miraculous coolness of the universe. And I'm like, you would be so good at that.
How much of it do you think is the lack of like a narrative that can get told at each developmental level of kind of learning and such? Like if you take like the Jonah story, you can tell it to a kid that's thinking in some type of
and scare the shit out of them,
magical way. Tell it in a mythical way. Tell it in a much more straightforward, this is what's going on as ancient Hebrew children's thing. Here's the like moral lesson. Tell it in a like disturbing your
Right, but I mean, I could tell the same kid the story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and how we shouldn't ostracize people because they look differently. And people have, for many years, told the story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And nobody thinks it's rooted in any kind of truth, but it still communicates a deep truth that kids can inculcate. Like, it's a myth, it's a story, but it makes no pretense to being true.
Well, no, I mean the like why humanist type ones don't exist is you don't have institutions with shared stories, because like if you
you gotta build those. Like, for instance, I got this good shared story, and it's a shared story about how complex life forms emerged out of simple life forms,
mm-hmm.
and ultimately consciousness and morality emerged out of complex life forms. And like, there's this trajectory in which life is becoming more loving and more kind. Like, and you're part of it. You're part of this huge story. Like, let me tell you a story that ties it all together. And you go like, wait a second, is anybody actually telling that story? And the answer is, oh yeah. Scientists, evolutionary biologists are telling the story all the time. They just don't tell it with any poetry. They don't tell it in a beautiful way. But when you pick up a book like Ursula Goodenough's The Sacred Depths of Nature, and she tells that same story, but she tells it in a way that makes you go like, hey, little child, sit on my lap and let me tell you about how, what happens when we die and how our cells break down and reconstitute themselves. And let me tell you about the circle of life. And you go like, wait a second, that could be just as in fact, that could be more beautiful than the Jonah story, because when the kid then goes off and into the woods by himself and starts looking at things under a microscope, he goes like, oh my gosh, that story resonates with everything I see. And so like the failure of narrative, I mean, ultimately, these other groups have had 2,000 years to make these beautiful narratives. And science has had like 300 years. And frankly, most of that time they've been fighting a rearguard action against messing with the status quo and being like put in jail for saying things like that the earth is not the center of the universe or that people don't rise from the dead. I think that now is the time for people who love life, natural life, the natural world, to start learning how to teach their children about it in a way that is so inspiring that it makes them want to be good. And that, I mean, I honestly, Tripp, I like you joke about me being a natural evangelist, but I look at people like you or like Brian McLaren or like any number, my dad, all these people. And I think like, oh my gosh, like you people are such natural storytellers. You've been making silk out of a sow's ear for all this time. Like you've got a story of a bloodthirsty, vengeful God who kills people in order to forgive them. Like, what if I gave you a prettier narrative? Imagine what you could do with it. And it's just a prettier narrative.
See, I'm the story of the emergence of life and stuff. I do that in confirmation every year. I have the story of the cosmos I do in 30 minutes and the 9 breakthroughs and the moments of emergence. Then I do like the story of scripture in 30 minutes and you tell that. And then at the end of it, everyone tells their own, kind of story and how it registers with the cosmic and sacred stories, and
you weave it all together.
Well, it's their job to to do their own, but like you're kind of equipping them to think through all of it. Because I even think that, but I don't know if I've told you this. So I got asked to go to when I was on my book tour to do a talk at like a humanist society, but they wanted me to do it like I was preaching a revival sermon. And so I was like, that's cool, but I'm going to use, I want my text to be from Plato. And, so.
Yeah.
And I was like, I've never, I don't know. I don't really feel like I have like a necessary competition agreement with other like sacred narratives. Like I don't.
Neither do I. Like when I have a college student come to me and they're grown up in a Christian family, and they're in a Christian, and they're in Christian relationships with their friends, and they have a Christian girlfriend or whatever. And like, they're struggling because they have a gay friend, and their church and their fellowship has told them that like gay people are not cool with God. And they're like, I'm going to give up Christianity. And I'm always like, hey baby, let me show you a way that you can stay a Christian and still be okay with gay people. And I'll help them, like, I'll show them some verses, or I'll show them a book, or I'll introduce, and they're like, why are you helping me stay a Christian? And I'm like, dude, like, your whole tribe is Christian. Like, it'll be hugely painful for you to step out of that. Like, I don't ride that motorcycle anymore, but I did for 30 years. I still know how to fix it. And yours just needs a minor adjustment. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not looking to sell you on secular humanism unless like that sucker won't ride for you anymore.
Yeah.
And so like, I don't have any competition thing. Like it doesn't matter to me whether your narrative is true or not true. It just matters to me whether it works to make you a more loving and happy human being. But sometimes I look at somebody like you or some of my friends, and I just think like, you do realize that there's this huge bunch of people that nobody's reaching out to. And like, if you come to them with that confirmation class thing, if you come to them with like a mixture of Christian language and secular language and all that stuff and understandings, and, they're going to be, they're going to be scared away, because they'll be like, oh, he's a supernaturalist and I'm not. And so some people, like, you go like, yeah, but I'm not really a supernaturalist. Like, yeah, then take off the freaking collar. Then just go talk use, like, what did Paul say? Like, speak their language. Just speak.
I haven't been a supernaturalist. I mean, well, I'll just say, until I met people that supernaturalism meant just believing in God at all, then okay.
Right.
But Justin, I went to tell this person who is a professional philosopher that all 9 used philosophy of science textbooks in all major universities to find supernaturalism as an understanding of the deity that is external to the world, that intervenes and breaks natural law. Now, that is if that's supernatural, then I'm not one. And I always tell people that's the stupidest idea. I'm not sure that I wonder that anyway. So
all I'm saying is, like, I know what I sense what you
sacred story and secular story. I've never experienced I don't see
you never
how
met
we
anybody
come to understand the world in scientifically as necessarily secular in origin.
No, but like what I'm asking is this: is like, the difference between those kind of sacred texts and the stories that they're told there, and people who don't tell that there's some people that use those stories and there are other people that don't, right?
Yeah.
And I guess all I'm saying to you is that the cost of using those stories is that a huge swath of people get left out of the call to discipleship.
Do you think it can run the other way as well, where the cost of telling the scientific story and the popular way it's told, which tends to be a reductionistic one, where axiological problems are sociological, you seek data as salvation, managerial processes as salvation, information as access to truth, when
yes, that's terrible, isn't it? We have to get better at it.
That's why I was saying, like, I feel
that's why we need you, bro, because the problem is the people telling that scientific story aren't ministers.
No, they're not. I feel like I've wanted to tell my atheist friends, like, look, if you could hang out with me for a week, I'll tell you what to say. It'll work way better, because
that's right. That's the thing. Like, that's when I come over, when I go on the campus. I mean, evangelizing people at USC for me as easy as pie. I mean, you just walk up to somebody and you say, like, "Hi, I'm the Humanist Chaplain here," and they go like, "What's that?" And I say, "Well, I am here to support all the students who don't believe in any kind of supernatural reality, but want to pursue goodness for its own sake." And the kid goes, "Well, that's me." Could I join your community? And you go like, sure. And they're like, what do you have to believe? And they go like, strangely enough, you don't have to believe anything. You just have to value certain things. And if you value these things, you belong with us. But the problem is then when they get together and like, we're going to talk about friendship, or we're going to talk about social justice, or we're going to talk about fighting sexual assault on campus. Data doesn't get it done. You have to speak to people's hearts. You have to tell stories. You have to use cadences. You have to have poetry and music. You have to have all the human technology that we've developed in the context of traditional religions. And so the thing is, like, what somebody has to do is they have to figure out how to adapt all that technology to speak to people who can't wrap their head around the supernatural narrative at the center of it. And that's what, like, somebody like you could do that. And so I'm dying over here because I'm in this world where as many people as I can talk to are like, I want to join. And I get emails and they're like, I'm trying to figure this out. And I'm like, wow, where are all the other humanist ministers out there? And the answer is there are a lot of atheist leaders out there who want to debate Christians and put up videos talking about how stupid it is to believe in God and mock people who are really sincere in their faith. I got no interest in that. But man, there aren't many ministers. And so, like, I think about some of the people that are in your audience, and some of the people in your audience probably fall into that category of, they don't really believe in any kind of supernatural realities. And they're frustrated in some ways by being part of a subculture where they're so often misunderstood. And I guess what I'm sort of saying is, like, out there on the other side, there's all these people that are running around like sheep without a shepherd, waiting for somebody to say to them, listen, just because you don't believe in God doesn't mean that you aren't called, or that there isn't some kind of natural sucking sound pulling you into a life of service and meaning and purpose.
I mean, one of the reasons I think what you're doing is culturally difficult right now is for those people whose minds are shaped by the Enlightenment, they're going to be axiological. Like,
what does that mean, axiological? What do you mean by that?
Value, like the humanities. When you ask questions about teleology, meaning, purpose, axiological commitments, as opposed to kind of just objective science, empirical type stuff.
So poetry as opposed to data.
Right. So like when your kind of world picture is determined by the Enlightenment, you distinguish the two pretty drastically, and so they're kind of phobic of the poetics and narrative, and some do it for that purpose, which is why I think.
Do you really think that? Like, because like I think
we're methodologically phobic. And
I read this book called The Age of Wonder, which was about when all this science stuff was emerging, and the people that were doing the science were also doing the poetry. And
the emergence of it, that's a long discussion.
But you think it's broken off?
Yeah. No, I think that secular humanists' biggest problem are the metaphysical assumptions that scientists have brought in, that the scientists that function in the period of the Romantics didn't have, and that people today that are kind of if your science leads to everything human beings treat and pull us deeply as an epiphenomena, then you don't find it necessarily useful to lead by telling.
So now what's so interesting is, like, I just read this book called The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And it's about like moral decision making and how people make their moral decisions. And of course, what Haidt points out is that we think that we're rational beings that make rational decisions, but we're actually rationalizing beings.
Yeah.
That make our decisions in our guts based on some very primal urges, and then use our brains to create stories that make it seem like those were rational choices. And so what hate ends up saying is like, if you, what any advertiser will tell you, what any politician will tell you, what any educator will tell you is that if you are rational and you want to move people in any direction, if you're rational, you don't speak to their reason. A rational person speaks to the heart.
Yeah. That was like, in Whitehead's book on, religion in the making, that was one of his points was, human beings lapse into rationality 0.1% of the time. And the mature ones might get to 0.5%, because almost everything we do is emotively there and then shaped by the stories we tell. So, and
the more we learn about science, the more we learn about neuroscience, the more we learn about moral ethnography and all this stuff, the more we realize that that's true. You're absolutely right. So the question is, when a good scientist who cares about the future of the species, when a good scientist who cares about poverty and justice reads that data, he goes like, damn, I better go find me a poet.
Yeah, because they're like, you obviously poetry and public discussion about this is not on the tenure track application. So that's one of the points about the Enlightenment was that the university system where it happens actually doesn't reward people for successfully communicating in ways that change actions to the masses, the very things they're learning.
Exactly.
And like the other side of it is that postmodern people fear meta narratives. So when they say, oh, here's an evangelist Bart doing the religious thing, like that whole like fear of a narrative that we hold together in community thing leads to an allergy towards meta narratives, which then you dismiss bad ones and good ones all at the same time.
But you know that
human beings don't have them, which is the thing that just you're like, have you met the human that doesn't have a story? Ask them how they got there, and then they'll tell you a story.
Well, and that's why I think like the idea that like I'll sometimes be around people who have been hurt by religion, and they'll say, "Yeah, we want to have groups that don't have any leaders." Because we got messed up by leadership, and so we want to do everything by consensus. And you end up saying like, "Hey, my friends, I hate to break it to you, but the answer to bad leadership is not no leadership. It's good leadership. And as hard as that may be to find, you've got to find it." I would say the same thing about meta-narratives. Like you can say, oh, in this postmodern generation world, no, people are suspicious of meta-narratives. And they are, but they're suspicious of meta-narratives the way somebody who's just been food poisoned is suspicious of food. And then as they go like, they may not want to eat again, but eventually they will because they need to eat. And narratives, meta-narratives are like so fundamental to the human experience that even if you want to live without them, you cannot, you will not. You will adopt a meta-narrative, even if your meta-narrative is meta-narratives suck. Like, and so ultimately, that's why, like, I really am, I'm so passionate about trying to call poets, preachers, relators, because I'll tell you what, in the secular movement, the early adapters to secularity were the people that could afford to be marginalized socially, because you got marginalized if you said you didn't believe in God. And typically the people that were able to afford to pay that price were people that were already marginalized socially because they weren't very relationally gifted. And so the early atheist organizations are all made up of people who are not very relationally gifted. And so we need poets. We need pastors. We need relators. We need people like that who are willing to, who basically say, look, I'm going to be openly secular, because until I'm openly secular, until I start to create openly secular narratives and openly secular institutions and openly secular communities, the people who can't relate to community and social justice and meaningful relationships in the context of organized religions are out in the cold. So like basically what I'm saying is like, listen, the Titanic has sunk. There are all these people in the water. We need to build some lifeboats. And frankly, all those rational scientists, they can arm you with really cool information and stuff. But you know as well as I do, a guy like my dad, the great preacher, what makes him a great preacher is he reads a cold-blooded article And then he gets up and he says, I read this article and what this really means. And he tells it in a story that makes you want to jump up and down. And that's what we need, are people to take the cold data and turn it into a meta-narrative that isn't contradicted by the facts.
And I think part of it is that if science, when it's doing science, one of its greatest gifts is being faithful to it, to its tradition, is telling what came before it that it was wrong.
Changing your mind.
Then religion probably should see that as more as a positive thing than a negative thing, as opposed to like, what's being faithful? Saying the same shit they said in the 16th century. And
we do it in American politics too. If a politician 20 years ago said something and now they're saying the opposite, we say they waffled.
I feel like it's more if they said it 10 seconds before.
And I want my politicians to say I was wrong. I want my politicians to say I remember the crime bill that everyone's pillorying the Clintons on in 1993. And it is racist and it caused so much damage in poor communities. And I was living in a poor community in 1993 and I was for it. We were all for it. We were all stupid. We were all wrong. We all didn't look down the road and see the consequences. So if you want to hammer people for being wrong on the crime bill in 1993, I'm with you. But let's remember that was the times. And I think that business of changing your mind is one of the great gifts that the scientific method has given to humanity. Is that our survival depends on changing our minds. And so I just think I think there's poetry in there. There's even poetry in the idea of changing your mind and the beauty. We've all seen wonderful movies where at the end of the movie, somebody is enlightened or somebody shifts gears or somebody embraces something that they had been fighting. And you go yeah, can you make it beautiful? Can you make me cry with it? And I think that once we learn to make people cry with the truth, we have hope.
Yeah. And the other part is we have some problems to deal with as a species that need to be all hands on deck. So one of the reasons that I think it's helpful for people like you who have a background in religious communities is to realize, to deal with the ecological crisis or something like that, we're going to need to figure out how all the different wisdom traditions, and if we count humanist as one of them, can share the same ecological story and share the poetics and narrations that lead to us not killing the planet off. And one of the things I've found when you're involved in progressive causes as a religious person is a certain level of just inherent dismissal by people that are non-religious, more against you for whoever your crazy uncle is, I guess they imagine being there. And when you think of what the globe is facing, it seems that we should figure out ways to gather and hear all sorts of stories that lead to cooperation in addressing the sustainability of life on the planet.
Yeah.
And part of it, I think, has to do with that a mutual understanding being becoming a value in each community, right? For us to be able to understand each other and places that we come from, and when we gather and tell stories that motivate us, that's a value for each community for this type of relationship to exist.
Yeah. I think it's one of the things that I spend the most of my time doing in the secular world is trying to get them off. I mean, I think in some ways they feel like they've been persecuted by Christians, and so they turn around and defensively go you're stupid and and for them to really grasp a very deep place where their Christian friends and family are coming from, And understand, again, if you're rational, you know that people don't adopt their worldviews in a rational way. Mm-hmm. So the idea of holding somebody responsible for believing in an irrational narrative is irrational in itself. Like people that, and so a lot of times until you can convince somebody, the problem with the secular community, maybe the better way of saying this is the secular community, always criticizes the religious community, and they say they elevate faith over reason. But the secular community elevates reason over everything. And ultimately, the human race needs us all to elevate love over reason. Mm-hmm. And so in some sense to go like, listen, I am going to love this person because our future and our planet's future depends on it. And the fact that they are, to my mind, unreasonable or irrational, like I've got to find a way for that not to be the ultimate litmus test of their value as a human being. Because people's worldviews are adopted for almost any reason other than, I sat down and did a comparative analysis and, when I was, we are born into families. We are born into cultures. We are born into situations. And so I think that the secular community has a long way to go in educating one another, itself and one another on how to be respectful of people's supernatural beliefs. And it's easy for me because, of course, I held supernatural beliefs for a long time. I wasn't like you, Tripp. Like, I was a full-on supernaturalist, And so I understand why people enter into that stuff. And the fact that I don't think that it's true doesn't mean that I don't think it's authentic or sincere.
Well, and I think there's a sense where no matter who you are, like, even if you think you're doing the best job explaining what is attractive or not and being in someone else's situation, it's just always offensive if you tell them the truth about what it is they're doing. It's offensive if they're correct and it's your therapist telling you why you're being an idiot, and or your enemy who's just mocking you, or a friend who's like, oh, I completely understand that there's this I think it's just a normal human thing to protect yourself the moment someone from your kind of inherited ideological space is another decides to tell you what you're really doing or what you really mean or what's really going on. That's problematic, and it goes both ways. And
and that's, my biggest encouragement to secular people is don't talk about what Christianity is or isn't. Talk about what your community is about. But when I talk to Christians, they're always uncomfortable about me if I talk about what I don't believe. But when I start talking about what I am committed to, they go like, oh, I recognize that. like those are things I'm committed to. And so I think you're right. Like the whole idea of telling somebody, let me tell you what you believe, and let me tell you what I think of it. It's provocative. It puts people on the defensive. And so I think when I sit with folks that are secular humanists, I'm always telling them the thing to learn to talk about is what you are committed to. And I said, honestly, no Christian, your Christian family, your Jewish family, your Muslim family, nobody's going to understand what you're committed to until you can show them a community of people with whom you're doing it together. Mm. Don't tell me what you're committed to. Show me. And the fact of the matter is that most of us are unable to live up to our deepest values unless we're in a community of people that affirm and support us in doing that. Whether you're trying to overcome alcoholism or drug addiction, or whether you're trying to be a good exerciser, or whether you're, working for the Bernie Sanders campaign, or whether you're trying to pursue goodness in a serious way, you've got to get yourself into a tribe. Mm-hmm. And so, the thing about these conversations is, when people talk about their worldview or their faith, and again, I guess it's maybe the pastor in me, you can tell me all you want about your axiological this and your teleological that. Show me your community. Show me how you spend your money. Mm-hmm. Show me how you treat your children. Show me how you treat other people's children. And that's what that's what ultimately is the mark of a person's values, is not what they say, but how they live.
And like that's the end of a sermon you could have given at any point in your life, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like the fruit you bear that's the assessment place.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the funny thing. It's like, my dad always says to me, he says, gosh, what's remarkable to me about your deconversion is how little changed. Like you're still building the same kind of communities. You're still relating to people in the same kinds of ways. And I said, the only difference is that there are these hotspot moments where I don't have to do the gymnastics I used to have to do to make my sense that like I was marrying gay people back, 10, 12 years ago.
Before it was cool.
But you had to do some gymnastics to get there as a Christian. You had to find a way around certain things. You had to, and it's just, for me that the real difference is that this is I have a certain freedom because I don't have to work backwards to connect it to a tradition that wasn't really designed to countenance gay marriages. Like whatever you want to say about Christianity and its texts and its songs, like it wasn't designed for sexual equality.
I think it's got more going in it for patriarchy, forms of polygamous relationships, and weird sex guilt leading to singleness. Yes. And that's why I got to tell you, this secular community building, this humanist community building that I'm involved with, like there are some stuff that's really hard to figure out. And like, especially the money, is hard to figure out because, we don't have a group of people who have 10% of their income on the table ready to give, to support their counselors and their pastoral caregivers and all that kind of stuff. Like that's not there yet, or maybe never will be. But I got to tell you, it's a lot easier when you're like, I was working with a young person the other day, and, they're part of this formerly hidden group of people known as agendered people who just don't fit the binary. They don't identify as male or female. Mm-hmm. And like, I was just thinking as I was talking with this person and helping them to figure out how to reintroduce themselves to our community and how to be a part of a community, how much easier it was, trying to navigate that stuff without having to do all the workarounds that I used to have to do. Hey, I got a question for you. Like, you're down there, you're training all these people. You're part of, like, do the people that listen to your podcast know that you're a part of this hatchery thing? Probably. I mean,
maybe.
I mean, I don't like talk about it all the time, but it's come up.
But like, but they would probably know that you and all these theologian types that you bring on your podcast, like, then some level you're sort of engaged in training up or raising up a new generation of people to kind of like lead Christian communities.
Yes.
Would they know that about you?
I would imagine so. If you listen to the podcast, there's not a lot of other topics. It's right. Since it's a theology podcast.
Right. But it's, there's theology, and then there's theology with a bent towards like actual.
Yeah. I mean, the coolest, the podcast itself leads to me getting to have conversations with people across the church who are asking questions for the first time, be it about new types of communities or new types of faithfulness or questions around different things. The hatchery thing fits into that because here it's people that are like, it's like a startup seminary where you kind of have this prophetic imagination-ish thing going on where you're like, here's something I'm passionate about and I want to make a difference. So you do a master's in theology and social entrepreneurship, and theoretically you graduate like with your community or business around the cause or nonprofit going versus a stole and student loans.
Right. So the idea is like, people are coming there to kind of like hatch these different projects of goodness. They're projecting goodness into the world. And I guess what I'm wondering is like maybe you could just tell me, because like the people that I work with, like I'm trying to convince them to not just be part of a community, but to go out and make things happen. But the people that you've got are people that want to make things happen. What, like they're project starters, like they're sort of entrepreneurial. And I guess what I'm wondering is like, do you like, do you think that, I guess what I'm wondering is like, what's the biggest obstacle facing these people as they try to do these things? Like, is there something like that they always are running up against?
Well, I would say the two biggest like origin points are either something that pisses you off so much, you're like, this should not be the case, and I'm going to do something that when I'm dead, you can point at and be like, oh, she gave a shit about this. Or you just get so turned on by a topic or a cause or something, and you're like, there should be this. Everyone needs to know this. Everyone should be involved in this. And that leads to it. And so the biggest problem points, at least in the early part of the students that are here, is figuring out a sustainable shape for a new community that passion, be it exploding or raging against, gets connected to a form of community that is, sustainable. So like you're sitting here with this like drive and this dream, and then they run, like we have a whole social entrepreneurship program where you do like experiments, testing in different ways, how to build communities around what it is you're doing, connecting to current community anyway. So there's this like test and evaluate where you're trying to learn to think strategically and with the mind of a business entrepreneur creative around the community. But then the motivating factor is this like deep passion. So the correlating them to something sustainable to invest in part is the frustration, but it's also the exciting thing. Cause you could say like, if I figure it out, like I get to live a life where what I'm doing is where I live. Like that's what when you meet, one of our students has a brother who has like severe mental and physical handicap and was the primary caregiver. And he'd heard me speak somewhere and heard about the hatchery. And it's like, if I come, can I figure out how to start a community for people with intense special needs and their caretakers, where their experience and their friendship with each other is valued and celebrated in the community versus relegated. And I was like, that should exist, right? Like who's against that one? And, that's what, so each person has those type of stories. And the coolest part, at least for my side of it, because I would say for theologians, I'm pretty entrepreneurial, but that's not a lot of competition. So I'm connected on that sense, but it's not my thing. What I do is my job's like the director of theology and the humanities, and the MTS part is an MTS in public theology. In one sense, it's kind of introducing the history of religion, philosophy, and theology in the West, and you're engaging it to find your allies for critically, faithfully, creatively thinking around that particular topic. So it's not like you, here, take Hebrew Bible, but it's here are the texts. How have they, oppressed the group of people you're caring for, and you want to fight back? How are there stories that are life-giving? And here's 20th century German philosophy, which I'm thrilled to talk about it whenever people want to. And they're engaged around that. So like on my side, I do theology, humanities stuff. So like one of the classes is big history, and it's the, big cosmic history story. And I enjoy teaching that. It will, and I'm sure to come off like a giant cosmic sermon, to digital anthropology, to techno-spirituality class. Those are all like the cool, odd classes. And the assumption is no one knows what religious communities will look like in the future. So let's do interdisciplinary reflection on the phenomena of religion, and then see how new technology, community shaping, economic patterns are changing it, to then think about having communities of meaning so around the cause. And some of them would be self-consciously more church-like, and others are not at all. So it varies depending on the person.
Interesting. Yeah. So like, do you guys have a sense, like when you say that phrase, like nobody knows what religious communities will look like in the future? Of course, like I think that they'll look like, secular religious communities. Like increasingly, I think like the more and more they will have less and less to do with, there'll be more and more like people sort of like cast into the waters trying to figure out like, how do we get together and help each other survive? Is there a sense of impending social collapse that hangs over your thing where you're like, yeah, we're preparing people to do this work, like knowing that there's going to be this collapse in which we're going to need some people who know how to build little community, who know how to build a new kind of community out there. Do you guys talk much about like the trends of economic and social?
Yeah, well, one of the classes is built around that. So in that seminar itself, it's a lot more explicit. But when John Cobb came and did a lecture thing, and why I had him come was because he basically talked around how the wisdom traditions are one of the only places where people organize for community for the well-being of the other, and the thing that communities that gather around value as opposed to or values as opposed to value creation or monetary things is post-collapse, and whatever that exactly ends up looking like. You need to have people that that know how to facilitate and lead communities and empower people. And
yeah, that's where I come in a lot, and that's I think that collapse is coming.
So if people are going, what collapse in the world are they talking about? What's your kind of breaking it to the freshmen in college that they're very lucky to be getting their education right now?
Well, lucky or wasting a lot of money that, because.
Or privileged to be an opportunity at USC.
Oh yeah. It's amazing.
Go into it knowing the opportunities to actually help human beings, which most people don't have when you leave a prestigious place when the market's functioning well and human beings are thriving. You have opportunities to work a lot so that at some point in your life you have a spare 3 hours a week to do something meaningful. So in one sense, you're like, well, you came here for success, but you could really succeed.
I think a lot of my work at USC is being subversive, trying to convince people that what the university defines as success and as a good use of their gifts and talents and education actually isn't, and that there's this other route that they should take that will actually lead to more meaning creation and a better world. But I have to tell you that like many of these students are so caught up with trying to find where they're going to fit into the system that they never step back from the system long enough to go, oh my gosh, the whole thing's unsustainable.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, like 2008 was probably just a tremor. It wasn't the earthquake, or Ebola was probably just a harbinger. It wasn't the pandemic flu, Iran's nuclear program may not be the one we most have to worry about. Like, there are so many things, like, it's like we have a circle of dominoes and I don't know which one will tip first, but they'll all affect the others. An environmental crisis would affect the economy. An economic crisis will affect the environment. Both of them will affect kind of
mass migration in Europe.
Yeah, all that stuff. And so, like, my interesting thing is that your friend John Cobb, who says, I would contend that almost whenever a human community gets together, it gets together for the purpose of serving others. I mean, it's three people that get together and go like, my best interest is served by looking after your best interest. That's like the nature of of any kind of social group. But then when you start to look at like, but my little tribe's well-being is caught up with the well-being of the tribe next door because we trade with them and because we want to be in good relationships with them. What's interesting is that I think ultimately, that is the big ticket, is how do you inspire people to come together in a way that is sustainable and that is good for not just them, but for everyone around them. And that's my thing. Is like, my fear is that all the technologies that we have right now for building those kind of communities depend on being able to say to people, and you should do this because like it is God ordained. And I worry that in the aftermath of that kind of collapse, that much the same way a lot of people's faith in God was crushed by the Holocaust. They were like, oh, you know what? It turns out nobody's at the controls here. That when this next collapse comes, I'm worried that you'll have a lot of people out there that desperately need to be part of loving, sustainable communities. Small groups of people that know how to grow their own food, care for each other, resolve conflict, work things out in the absence of, and they won't have the technology to do that except around a narrative that none of them believe anymore. And so in some ways, that's why, again, secular community building feels important to me right now, is because I'm convinced that in the aftermath of the crisis, the communities that we have right now won't make it through.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it makes sense. And I think there's a need for, communities that are built to be able to do that across the spectrum. It would be very sad if the collapse is intense, that the only ones able to do it are anti-intellectual religious expressions.
And I don't think they're going to be able to do it nearly as effectively as they have in the prior to the collapse.
Right.
Because right now you can still make a case for, it feels like there's some order. It feels like there's somebody at the controls. It feels like history has a destiny built into it. I think in the aftermath of a huge social collapse, people all of a sudden go like, I don't think there's anybody running this show.
Yeah.
And then you have to figure out like, so now where, because a lot of people, when they first give up Christianity, they go through a nihilistic period where they can't figure out why anything's meaningful. Mm-hmm. And I worry that our whole society will be in that space, and that won't be a good space to be in. And so, I guess, it's funny. I'm thinking about the people listening to your podcast, and I'm thinking there's probably some folks out there that are hanging on. And because for maybe some of the same reasons I hung on for so long, it's like, I wanted to be part of a movement that was about all this good stuff. And it felt to me like Christianity was the only game. And I guess, if nothing else, maybe someone will hear like, hey, there's this little startup game.
So where if they're sitting there on the edge of their anxious bench, the secular humanist anxious bench, their heart's been strangely warmed.
Hallelujah.
And they want to holler at Bart Campolo. Yes. How do they do it?
Hey, it's easy. I mean, first of all, if they wanted to like hear how this conversation goes, I have a podcast called Humanize Me. And it's kind of me talking with people every week or two about what does it mean to pursue goodness on the other side of faith. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing. Then there's bartcampolo.org, which is where you can kind of find all things Bart Campolo. There's actually a documentary. You were asking about my dad. There's a documentary that my friend John Wright's making right now called With Whom I Am Well Pleased, which is a story about like me coming out secular, mm-hmm. and kind of how my relationship with my dad sort of weathered that storm, and kind of the way we relate to each other. And so I mean, there'll be a lot of that stuff out there in the next year, but right now, it's bartcampolo.org. That's the place to come find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking the time to hang out on the internet.
This was really fun. Thank you so much.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.